Queensland rent caps. Queensland Premier Annastacia Palaszczuk may be implementing a rental cap on investment properties, rental properties in Queensland. In this episode, we'll talk about what might happen, is it fair, and also the implications if it actually goes ahead. This is massive news. We talked about land tax in Queensland and a rent freeze last year. That didn't go through. In this episode, we'll take it one level further because they're back at it. Give it a thumbs up, give this video a like, let's get into it. So Queensland government looking seriously at rent caps amid soaring housing stress. A report commissioned by the Queensland Council says 150,000 households are under housing stress. What that means is rental pressure, and about 100,000 would typically be eligible for social housing. Okay, so it's basically the lowest socioeconomic stratum which is really struggling, and you feel for them because we have record rent increases, we have record low supply of rental properties, which by the way is kind of their own doing because of making investing so difficult for investors with APRA clampdowns and so many things that have gone on in the last 5 years. Anyway, average waiting times for social housing are more than 2 years, and the issue is especially pronounced with families with children, and nothing is good here. Like, this is not a good thing. They're saying median rents rose 80% in central Queensland, Gladstone, 51% in Noosa, 33% on the Gold Coast in the last 5 years. So Queensland Government Premier Annastacia Palaszczuk has confirmed rent caps will be discussed at a meeting of the government, industry and advocacy groups next week. So she's serious about this. So what are rent caps? A rent cap is effectively where you say, look, we're not going to be, as landlords, as property investors, increase the rent willy-nilly on our investment properties dictated by the free market. If demand versus supply dictates that our 500 rent should go up to 550, we won't be able to do that. We'll have to comply by regulatory standards on an artificial limit. Now, last year they talked about Queensland land tax. If you recall how if you had multiple properties across different parts of the nation, but even one in Queensland, the Queensland government would tax you effectively based on the threshold of land tax, which includes all of your property holdings across Australia. So your land tax in Queensland might go from nothing to like $3,000, $5,000, something like that overnight. That got scrapped. There was massive outbreak. It got shelved. They also talked about, from the Greens, rental freeze, where you wouldn't be able to increase rents for 2 years, and after that it would only go up by 2% per year. Once again, massive outrage. It just got shelved. This is their third attempt. Third time lucky? Maybe. Their third attempt at saying, okay, well maybe a rent freeze was too intense. You can increase it, but there's a cap on how much you can increase it. It's very interesting because in the ACT, landlords have to calculate changes in the CPI between rent leases, okay? And they can only add up to 10% of that number to come up with a prescribed rental increase amount. So if inflation is 2%, they can only add up to 10% on 2% in terms of their rent increase. Now, is that better than a rent freeze? Absolutely. And to be honest with you, like, this rental crisis is such a problem. It is so drastic and chronic, and with building approvals falling down, it's only going to get worse and worse. So I'm actually not opposed to a rent cap, if I'm being completely honest. Yes, I live in a capitalistic society. I'm a property owner with, $10 million of property. So you'd expect me to say, hey, all of this is garbage. Let the free market do what the free market wants to do. But I actually, I think we should have a conscience, and I think we need to be conscious capitalists. So I don't think 10% is quite right. I think that's up for debate. Let me know in the comments what you think, but I think something like this is more reasonable, something pegged to CPI. So if CPI is running at 7%, maybe landlords are able to increase it by 7 plus 10%, 7 plus 20%, 7 plus 15%, something like that. Okay, I think that's reasonable. I think, in some of my properties, I've increased the rent from like 400 to 600 over the last year, and the tenants have been okay with it, but it does hurt them. It is like a big shock to the system. So I don't think think we need to be socialists, but I think we need to be conscious capitalists. And something like that, where in the ACT, the rental increases pegged to CPI, I think is reasonable, but maybe not 10%, something a little bit higher than that. Otherwise, that pressure, that acute rental shortage pressure builds up, and in 5 years or 10 years, because I don't see this going away anytime soon, something's got to break, okay? Because if you put enough pressure into a cylinder, ultimately it breaks. So we do need to let off the steam, and I think that might be something like CPI plus 20% or something like that, instead of a willy-nilly, my rent just went up by 50%. But I am not backing the government on this. Let that be clear, because even though the government says we have a chronic homelessness problem, that we have a problem with the affordability of rental properties, the reality is that the government has dropped the ball on this. It's no one's responsibility, apparently, in Australia to provide housing. The RBA doesn't take it on board, APRA doesn't take it on board, ASIC doesn't take it on board, the state governments don't take it on board, the local councils don't take it on board, they don't release any land basically these days. The federal government just talks about it, doesn't actually do about it. Check this out, right? Public housing in Australia comprises of 3.1% of all housing. Compare this to Europe, where in some places it's like more than 50%. Even in America, the land of the free market, it's way more than 3%. So this is ridiculous. The government has really dropped the ball, and they're trying to penalize private landlords. Here, this is the proportion in Australia, 27.8%. They're trying to penalize private landlords, and saying you should provide a public good. No, that's what the government should do. That's their job, not the free market. But I do believe in conscious capitalism. You can see here, this is very, very stark numbers. Owner-occupiers, obviously, around 65 to 70%. Landlords coming in, doing the government a favor, providing a lot of rental properties, and then community and public housing basically negligible. Now, what are the implications of rental cap? Like, what would that mean? There was a parliamentary committee held in 2022 when the Residential Tenancies and Room Accommodation Rent Freeze Amendment Bill was proposed. This is where they were just going to freeze rent, and it was very damning. This is what it had to say. Stick with me. This is very interesting. Potential impacts of a rent freeze and cap on future increases. So kind of what we're in for potentially now. All right. According to submitters opposed to the bill, the policy to be implemented makes the incorrect assumption that all landlords are wealthy and making large profits off their tenants. Stats show that the average property investor has only one property and earns less than $120,000. Certainly not a rich mogul. Okay. Attempts to make private landlords responsible for providing social housing a responsibility of the government. What do you guys think? Do you think landlords are responsible for providing shelter, or is it the government? Number 3, positions the government to be restricting the free market economy. We've got to make our mind up. Are we a socialist state? I'm not going to get into all of that. Or are we a free market, laissez-faire, capitalistic society? Where are we in the middle? If we're meant to be a capitalist democracy, then really this whole idea of providing free housing to anyone and everyone, it doesn't quite sit right. Now, I'm not going to get into that debate, but this is what they positioned. Number 4, appears to have been developed with limited appreciation for commercial realities of residential tenancy relationships and their link to Queensland's social and economic well-being. In other words, in the long term, the economic output or consequence is really dire, where less and less investors will own rental properties with less stock, more of an acute problem. Supply is too less. Disincentivizes investors and could exacerbate the current homelessness and housing crisis, as rental stock may be removed from the same deal in the short term. Does not address the root cause of Queensland's housing crisis, which is due to a lack of housing supply. And how do we get to a stage where there's lack of housing supply? Of course, demand has gone through the roof, a lot of net internal migration into Queensland, but the local councils, they don't release land. Like, as a developer in Brisbane, it's like, have to tear your hair out to get something DA'd or development approved. The Brisbane City Council, etc., they just don't approve things. Like, the things they used to approve before, they don't approve now. So how are you going to create higher density? How are you going to provide more housing if the councils don't allow you? And the last one will have a negative impact on the quality and quantity of rentals in the market. Okay, so what this is saying is like, okay, I can't increase my rent. Well, I got to cut back on maintenance, this and that, because council rates are going up, interest rates are going up, insurance premiums, everything else is going up for the landlord except for this. And I know the age-old argument is like, okay, well, this will force landlords out, and that means that house prices come down. The reality is, when this has been benchmarked in other places around the world, rental caps, etc., like in Ireland, for example, landlords haven't necessarily sold their properties, right? Like they've suffered more, but they haven't sold. In fact, what's happened is that the most lower socioeconomic, the poorer people, they've struggled even more because they were never able to afford a property, even if property prices fell by 10, 20, 30, 40%. So even if they do go back, prices fall 10%, 20%, doesn't mean that all of a sudden housing is all of a sudden, affordable for everyone. Think about Sydney, think about Melbourne, think about Brisbane. If the median value of a property is $1 million, it goes down to 900. All of a sudden, the person making 50K in annums, they still can't afford it. So it misses the problem entirely. It's not the middle income earners who are really hurting by these rental shortages and rental increases. Of course, that's not good. It's really the lower or the quote unquote poorer people. Okay, and that doesn't solve that. They're never going to be able to afford a property anyway. That's not a good statement for me to say, but that's kind of the reality, is what research has found. So if this bill does get passed through, if Annastacia has her way, third time lucky, what does that mean? Well, we need to see what a rental cap actually looks like. It could be like the ACT, in which case I don't think it's a big deal, right? But if it's a hard cap, like, only 2% per annum or 4% per annum, 5% per annum, then, okay, you're kicking the can down the road. Landlords aren't going to all of a sudden sell their properties. That's not what happens. But over the long term, the pent up supply shortage will get more and more chronic, more and more acute, where in the future another government will have to come in and release or open the pressure valve, going back to free market. All of a sudden rents might double. Now, is that a good thing for that shock for renters? Absolutely not. Okay, so I don't see how a good outcome can come about this. I know that for all of you Greens or people on the left, you'll say house prices will come down, now people can actually afford, but the studies have shown that that doesn't actually happen, okay? Maybe, a few incremental people, those people that were maybe, just a bit off being able to afford property, now they can get onto the property ladder, but the reality is that more than 50, 60, 70% of renters, they're not able, or they don't want to be a property owner. And even if prices fell because landlords were forced to sell because of this price cap, that doesn't mean all of a sudden everyone can afford property. So there's no panacea to this problem. There's no perfect solution. It's a hard problem to solve, but the solution is more supply. More supply comes at a federal, state, and council level. Council needs to release more land. State needs to reduce stamp duty so there's more flow of property transactions. And the government needs to think about supply and more satellite cities, infrastructure between secondary, tertiary cities and the main CBD, so employment nodes can go inland and people can commute. A bit like Gosford to Sydney. If you had a bigger population centre, more job industry in Gosford, then all of a sudden people don't need to live in Sydney. They can go up there. That's what I'm talking about. So the solution is three-tiered government doing its job. It's not penalising investors for just trying to get ahead. My name's PK. I don't know if you agree with me, but let me know if you do. It's a very highly contentious subject. I don't think it's the end of the world if a rental cap does come in, if it's like the ACT, but if it's something more stringent, God, I would not want to be a renter then. Hit subscribe, hit the like button, let me know your opinion in the comments. Catch you later. See you next time.